Act 1. Contempt and shock. The potato salad was someone else in Apo's recipe. I knew this the moment I tasted it. Too much mustard, not enough dill, but I said nothing. That and Apo's what I do now. I say nothing. I sit in the lawn chair that sinks a little on the left side, the one nobody else wants, and I watch the world perform itself for an audience of itself, and I say nothing. My granddaughter Petra had insisted I come. Grandma, you never leave the house anymore. Grandma, fresh air is good for you. Grandma, Uncle Derek will behave. That last one I doubted the moment she said it. Derek has never behaved a day in his adult life. He simply got old enough that people started calling it personality. The 4th of July gathering was at my sister Connie and Apo's house in Fairhope, Alabama. A big white colonial with American flags on both porch columns and a wind chime shaped like a bald eagle. The backyard stretched long and green, and there were maybe 40 people I half recognized and a dozen I didn't, and Apo's know at all. Someone had set up a cornhole board. A man in a Keep America Great hat was losing badly to a 12-year-old and pretending he wasn't Apo's trying. I sat near the azalea hedge, as far from the speakers as the yard allowed, and I watched. I am 71 years old. I have gray hair I no longer bother coloring, and I wear it in a braid that Petra once called dignified and Derek once called scraggly. I was wearing my good blue linen blouse, the one without the frayed collar, because Petra had asked me to dress nice. My hands, resting on my knees, are the hands of a woman who has done hard things. I look at them sometimes and I think, these hands know things the rest of me is still trying to forget. Derek found me, as Derek always finds me, approximately 20 minutes after I arrived. He is my late husband Roy and Apo's nephew, a distinction I and Apo's never found meaningful, and he is the kind of man who fills a room not with presence but with noise. He sells insurance in Mobile and coaches his son in Apo's little league team and has opinions about everything except the things that matter. He was carrying a sweating bottle of craft beer and wearing a shirt with an American flag on the chest, a different flag from the one on his hat, as though one flag wasn't Apo's quite enough patriotism to contain him. End quote, Margaret. End quote, he said my name like a sigh. End quote, didn't and Apo's think you and Apo's make it. Connie said you might cancel. End quote. End quote. I and Apo's am here, end quote, I said. End quote. Good, good. End quote. He settled into the empty chair beside me without asking, the way he always does. End quote. You doing okay? Still living out there in that, what do you call it? The cottage. End quote. End quote. The house, end quote, I said. End quote. I call it the house. End quote. End quote. Right, right. End quote. He took a long pull of his beer and looked out at the yard with the satisfied expression of a man surveying his own kingdom when it isn't and Apo's End quote. Well, good for you. Living simple. Nothing wrong with that. End quote. I said nothing. He lasted about 3 minutes in the silence before the itch took him. Derek cannot stand silence. Silence to Derek is an accusation. End quote. You know what I was telling Jimmy earlier? End quote. He nodded toward a man I didn't and Apo's recognize across the yard. End quote. About veterans. About how we thank them but we don't and Apo's really support them, you know? Like, the real heroes, end quote. He gestured broadly at the gathering. End quote. 4th of July, everyone waves their flags. But do they actually know anyone who served? End quote. I looked at my hands. End quote. I mean, I almost joined up, end quote. Derek continued, for perhaps the 15th time in my presence. End quote. Right out of high school. Had the paperwork and everything. But my dad needed me at the shop, so, end quote. He shrugged, the shrug of a man surrendering to his own mythology. End quote. Duty to family, you know? That and Apo's a kind of service too. End quote. Across the yard near the back gate, a man arrived that I didn't and Apo's recognize. He came in quietly, no announcement, no fanfare, wearing civilian clothes, khaki slacks and a white button-down, but something about the way he moved made the yard feel different. He was perhaps 55, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of stillness in his face that you only get from years of teaching yourself not to show what you and Apo's feeling. He greeted Connie and Apos' husband Bill with a handshake, and Bill looked genuinely honored by it. I looked back at my hands. End quote. You ever serve? End quote. Derek was asking me now, with the particular condescension of a man who already knows the answer he expects. End quote. Yes, end quote, I said. He blinked. End quote. What branch? End quote. End quote. Navy. End quote. He laughed. Not cruelly exactly. The way people laugh when they end Apos, re-surprised. End quote. No kidding. What in Apos? Do you do administration? Nursing? End quote. End quote. Aviation, end quote, I said. End quote. Then other things. End quote. End quote. Huh. End quote. He seemed genuinely uncertain how to proceed, so he defaulted to mockery, which is where he always returns. End quote. Well, I never would and Apos we guessed. You don and Apos. T exactly have the no offense the look. End quote. End quote. What look is that? End quote. End quote, you know. The military look. That bearing that, end quote. He was gesturing vaguely at my braided gray hair, my sinking lawn chair. End quote. You just seem like more of a I don and Apos Tino. A librarian type. End quote. There was laughter from the people nearby who and Apos. D been half listening. I recognized one of them, Connie and Apos' neighbor Trish, who had always been kind to me in isolation and unkind to me in crowds. End quote. You know what they call me? End quote. I said quietly, not to Derek, not really to anyone. It came out before I could stop it. The words surfacing the way old things do when you and Apos retired and the day is hot and someone has been small to you for long enough. End quote. What and Apos that? End quote. Derek leaned in, smiling. End quote. Ghost Rider, end quote, I said. I don and Apos. T know why I said it. I hadn't and Apos. T said it aloud in over 20 years. The yard didn't and Apos T stop. The cornhole boards kept thunking. The eagle wind chime kept singing in the July heat. But something shifted at the edge of my vision, a movement, and when I looked up, the man with the silver hair was standing very still near the azalea hedge, 12 feet away, and he was looking at me. Not looking at me the way people look at old women in lawn chairs, absently incidentally. He was looking at me the way you look at something you thought you and Apos D never see again. He took 2 steps toward me. Then he stopped. Then, slowly, and I watched this happen with a feeling I cannot fully describe, something between vertigo and grief, he stood up very straight, his heels together, his hands at his sides, and he said to me in a voice that carried clearly across the nearest radius of conversation. End quote. Ghost Rider. End quote. Not a question. The yard quieted in a ripple, the way yards do when something real interrupts the performance. End quote. I and Apos am sorry, end quote. Derek started, end quote. Do you, end quote. End quote. Asterisk ma and Apos. Asterisk, end quote. The man stepped forward, and now he was close enough that I could see his eyes, which were the light gray of winter water, and which were bright with something raw. End quote. Margaret Caulfield. Ghost Rider. F/A18 Scene 71. Gulf of Oman. 2003. End quote. I felt my throat close. End quote. I and Apos am Admiral James Harrow, end quote, he said. End quote. Retired, end quote. And then to Derek and Apos' visible astonishment, to Trish and Apos' audible intake of breath, to the confusion of everyone within 20 feet. He did something I had not expected. He put his right hand over his heart. End quote. I have been looking for a way to thank you, end quote. He said, end quote. For 22 years, end quote. Hashtag Act 2. The glorious past. The yard had fully stilled by then. Someone had turned down the music. I don and Apos T know who. Admiral Harrow, Jim, he would ask me to call him, and I would fail to do so all evening. Pulled a chair from the nearest table without being asked and sat across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and he spoke to the gathering that had slowly formed around us, not because he wanted an audience but because he needed witnesses. Because some truths, he said, require witnesses to survive. End quote. August 14, 2003, end quote, he said. End quote. We had a downed pilot, Commander Thomas Reese, in a canyon system near the Makran coast. The rescue window was closing. There were active air defense batteries that had just come online, batteries our intelligence had an oppo, end quote. And then the pilot launched anyway, end quote. Trish said very softly, end quote. Oh my God, end quote. End quote. She went in on the deck, below radar acquisition altitude, through that canyon system, threading a flight path that by rights should have been her coffin. She suppressed 3 of the 4 battery sites. She took hits, her aircraft was damaged, and she circled back and suppressed the 4th, end quote. He stopped, end quote. She circled back, end quote. The phrase sat in the hot July air, end quote. The rescue helicopter got in and pulled Reese out with 6 minutes to spare, end quote. He looked up at the people standing around us, end quote. Commander Reese retired a captain. He has 4 grandchildren. He coaches youth basketball in Pensacola on Tuesday nights. He exists because, end quote. His voice caught briefly and he steadied it, end quote. Because Ghost Rider went back, end quote. I was looking at my hands again. I had not moved. I felt the way I imagine mountains feel during earthquakes, still on the surface, everything shifting underneath, end quote. I have told this story, end quote. Jim Harrow said quietly now, end quote. At promotion ceremonies, at memorials, at the Naval War College. I tell it without a name because the pilot was never publicly identified as the one who made that run. I never knew why. I spent years trying to understand why. And tonight I walk into a backyard in Fairhope, Alabama, and I hear those 2 words, end quote. He stopped. He didn't, and oppose. T finished the sentence. I did not help him finish it. Derek had not spoken in 4 minutes, which was, to my knowledge, a personal record. ## Act 3. The hidden injustice. They gave me a court-martial instead of a medal. I want you to understand something about that sentence. I want you to feel the particular weight of it, the way I felt it, standing in a room in Bahrain in September of 2003 with my dress uniform still carrying the faint smell of jet fuel that no dry cleaning had fully removed. I want you to understand what it costs a person to be 29 years old and told, formally with paperwork, that the thing they did to save a man and Appo's life was an act of insubordination that had endangered the mission, the fleet, and the lives of the rescuers. The charges were eventually reduced. They always say eventually reduced as though that softens it. Eventually reduced means months. It means lawyers. It means watching the people above you talk about you in documents while you and Appo's not in the room. The man who filed the initial charges was Captain Leonard Voorhees. Leonard Voorhees, who had been the senior officer in the CIC when I launched. Leonard Voorhees, who had said unsurvivable into his headset and who had, in that moment, I believed it, and who had therefore already in his mind written Thomas Reese off, written him down as a loss to be logged and processed and survived professionally. And then I had an Appo's T died, and Thomas Reese was alive, and Leonard Voorhees had a problem. The problem was this. If my run was reported accurately, it would reveal that the abort had been premature, that the battery sites were suppressible, that a pilot under his command had seen what command could not see and had acted on it, and been right. It would raise questions about his judgment, about the risk assessments he and Appo's approved, about the word unsurvivable. Leonard Voorhees became, in the year after, one of the fastest rising officers in the Pacific Fleet. He gave interviews. He received commendations. He spoke at a Pentagon briefing about operational risk management, and in that briefing he mentioned, obliquely without names, the reckless unilateral action of a junior officer in 2003 that had nearly compromised a CSAR operation. I heard about this briefing years later. By then I was out. By then I was living in a small house in Alabama, trying to remember how to sleep. The charges against me had left a notation in my record. Not a conviction, eventually reduced, remember, but a notation. A shadow. The kind of thing that follows you through selection boards and promotion reviews and assignment requests. The kind of thing that doesn't in Appo's need to say much to say everything. I left the Navy in 2005. I told people it was my choice. It mostly was by then. The official account of the August 2003 CSAR operation described a successful extraction under enemy fire, coordinated air support, and superior tactical execution. Ghost Rider does not appear in that account. The callsign had been scrubbed from the records by the time the incident report was finalized. I know this because 7 years later, A journalist trying to write about the Makran operations asked to interview me in Kuden and Apos. Find the mission anywhere in the logs. I told him he probably had the wrong name. He did. He had the name Voorhees had given it. I did not correct him. I had by then become very good at saying nothing. I told Jim Harrow some of this. Not all of it. Enough. The yard had mostly returned to itself by then. The cornhole game resumed, the eagle wind chime singing. But a small circle remained near the azalea hedge. Jim and Petra, who had appeared at my side at some point and taken my hand and not let go. And Derek, who stood with his beer bottle hanging at his side with the specific stillness of a man being rewritten. Jim listened without interrupting. He had the kind of listening that combat teaches. Total physical, every part of his attention committed. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. End quote, Voorhees, end quote, he said. End quote, yes. End quote. Something moved across his face and then settled back into stillness. End quote. He and Apos. Giving the keynote at the American Defense Leadership Symposium in 2 weeks. In Washington. End quote. I knew this. I had read it in the newsletter I and Apos. Never unsubscribed from, the one that came to my email every month like a ghost of the person I used to be. Captain Leonard Voorhees, Ret. Author of Courage Under Fire Leadership Lessons from the Modern Naval Theater, will deliver the keynote address. I had read it and closed the laptop and gone to water my tomatoes. End quote. Thomas Reese will be there, end quote, Jim said. End quote. He and Apos. On the planning committee. End quote. I looked at him. End quote. He knows, end quote, Jim said. End quote. He and Apos always known. He found out 6 months after his rescue. A friend in records. He and Apos spent 20 years trying to find Ghost Rider through the right channels. End quote. A pause. End quote. The right channels, as you know, were not particularly helpful, end quote. Petra and Apos' hand tightened on mine. End quote. Grandma, end quote, she said softly. End quote. I know, end quote, I said. End quote. He deserves to know you and Apos, re-alive. End quote. End quote. I know, end quote, I said again. The eagle wind chime sang in the July heat. The potato salad with its too much mustard sat untouched on the table beside me. I thought about a cockpit in 2003, the shudder of the aircraft taking fire, the way the canyon walls had seemed close enough to touch, the moment when I had circled back. Not from heroism, not from some blazing moral certainty, but from the simple animal refusal to let a man die alone in a canyon while the paperwork was still being processed. End quote. Will you come? End quote, Jim asked. I thought about the notation in my record. The word unsurvivable. The house in Alabama with its sinking lawn chair. End quote. I and Apos. I'll think about it, end quote, I said. Hashtag Act 4. The truth revealed. The American Defense Leadership Symposium was held in a hotel ballroom in Arlington that tried, with its high ceilings and chandelier light, to suggest marble and permanence. There were perhaps 300 people in attendance. Officers, officials, think tank names, defense contractors in expensive suits, flags on both sides of the dais, a podium with a seal. I had not worn a uniform in 19 years. Jim Harrow had made some calls. The uniform had been updated, pressed, correctly appointed. I stood in the elevator of the hotel the morning of the keynote and looked at my reflection in the mirrored door and thought, there she is, the woman I had put away, packed into a box in the back of a metaphorical closet and decided to leave there. She looked older than I remembered. She looked like she had earned every year of it. Thomas Reese was waiting in the lobby. I knew him from photographs, older now, heavier, with a kind face that had been kind even in his rescue photos, even pale and oxygen depleted in the back of a helicopter. When he saw me, he stopped walking in the middle of the lobby, and the people flowing around him parted like water around a stone. We stood there for a moment. There are no words that are adequate to the moment when the person you saved is standing in front of you. Alive, real, made of decades you gave them. No words. He knew this too. He said, end quote, I have a granddaughter named Mara, after my wife. She and Apos S4. She already loves horses, end quote. I said, end quote, that and Apos S a good age for horses, end quote. He said, end quote, my son just made partner at his firm. And my other son, He and Oppos, S finishing his PhD, end quote, a pause. End quote. But I need you to know that it and Oppos, S there. All of it. In the room. Everywhere I go. End quote. I looked at this man who had been a voice in a cockpit, a coordinate in a canyon, a mission with a closing window. I looked at him standing solid and real in a hotel lobby in Arlington, Virginia, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 22 years. Not healed. Not resolved. Loosened. The first movement. End quote. Okay, end quote, I said. We went in. Leonard Voorhees took the stage at 11:15. I had seen him in photographs over the years, his book jacket, his conference programs, but in person he was both more and less than I expected. Smaller than I remembered. Heavier. He wore his retirement well, the way some men do, carrying himself with the authority of a title he no longer technically held. His hair was full and silver. His suit was navy, which I found almost funny. He was a good speaker. I and Oppos, I'll say that. He knew how to fill a room with himself, knew the rhythm of an audience, when to pause, when to let a phrase land. He talked about leadership. He talked about moral courage. He talked about the hard decisions. I sat in the fifth row between Jim Harrow on my left and Thomas Rees on my right, and I listened to Leonard Voorhees talk about moral courage. The specific wrongness of it, the specific physics of sitting in a room while a man uses the language of your sacrifice to decorate his reputation, is difficult to explain. It has a taste, metallic, like the inside of an oxygen mask at altitude. He was 20 minutes in when Thomas Rees stood up. The room shifted. Voorhees faltered slightly, continued, but his eyes had found Rees, and something moved in them. A recognition. An adjustment. End quote. I and Oppos. "Do like to say something?" End quote, Rees said. His voice was calm. It was the voice of a man who had been preparing 22 years for this particular calm. End quote. "Captain Rees, we and Oppos, I'll have time for," end quote, the moderator at the side of the stage began. End quote. "I and Oppos, do like to say something now if that and Oppos, S all right." End quote. Not aggressive. Not loud. Simply the voice of someone who knew his weight in the room, who the room knew, who the planning committee trusted. End quote. "It and Oppos, I'll only take a moment." End quote. The moderator looked at Voorhees. Voorhees looked at Rees. Then he smiled, the smile of a man who believes he can manage this, and said, end quote, "Of course." End quote. Rees turned to face the audience. End quote. "I and Oppos, am alive," end quote. He said, end quote, "because of a pilot who flew a run that was classified unsurvivable, suppressed 4 active battery sites alone, took fire and circled back," end quote. He let the silence breathe. End quote. That pilot was not mentioned in the incident report for that operation. The Callsign ghostwriter does not appear anywhere in the official record of the August 14, 2003 CSAR extraction. End quote. Another breath. End quote. "I would like to explain why." End quote. Voorhees and Oppos' smile had not moved. The kind of smile that is held in place by will. End quote. Because the senior officer in the Combat Information Center that day subsequently filed a report characterizing that pilot and Oppos' actions as reckless and insubordinate. And that characterization, end quote. Rees reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded document, end quote, as established by a FOIA request completed in January of this year, was authored by the same officer who, in the following year, received a Distinguished Service Medal for, quote, "superior leadership and tactical judgment in the coordination of Gulf of Oman CSAR operations." End quote. The room was very quiet. In the quiet, Jim Harrow stood. And for other people stood, men and women I recognized from the background conversations of the past 2 weeks, people Jim had contacted, people who had been in the CIC that day, who had been in Bahrain in the weeks after, who had signed documents they hadn't, and Oppos' fully understood and spent years understanding them. They stood one by one in the ballroom in Arlington, Virginia, in the chandelier light, and they stood facing the woman in the 5th row. Facing me. I rose slowly. My knees are not what they were. My uniform still fit somehow the way it had always fit, like armor, like a second skin, like the self I had stored and thought was lost. Leonard Voorhees looked at me from the stage. I Don and Oppos. Know what he saw. I cannot speak to what a man sees when the thing he buried stands up in a ballroom. I know what I felt, not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of a door long sealed, opening onto a room that had always been there, waiting, full of everything that had been put away. The moderator was speaking. Photographers were moving. Somewhere behind me I heard weeping. I Don and Appos. Tino whose. I stood in the 5th row of a hotel ballroom in Arlington, Virginia, and I thought, asterisk, there it is. There it is. There it all is. Asterisk. ## Act 5. Letting go and healing. Leonard Voorhees resigned from the symposium board 11 days later. The book, Courage Under Fire, was quietly pulled from the speaker and Appos' circuit schedule of the 3 universities that had booked him. His publisher did not announce a cancellation. They simply stopped responding to press inquiries about a second edition. I know these things because Petra sent me the articles 3 and 4 at a time, in the first week after Arlington. I read them the way you read weather reports about a storm that has already passed over your house. Interested but no longer afraid. He called me once. I did not expect this. He found my number through someone he Shuden and Appos. Have been able to find it through, which told me something about the network still available to men of his kind. It was a Thursday evening in late July, and I was on my porch watching the fireflies begin their early inventory of the yard. And my phone rang with an unknown number from Virginia. I almost didn't an Appos answer. I am glad I did. His voice was smaller than it had been at the podium. Not weak, not that exactly, but reduced. The way a room feels after the furniture has been moved out. End quote, Margaret, end quote, he said. End quote, yes, end quote, I said. A long pause. The fireflies continued their slow, patient signaling. End quote, I was afraid, end quote, he said. I waited. End quote, that day. I was afraid and I made calculations. And the calculations told me what I wanted them to tell me. End quote, another pause. End quote. I have told myself for 22 years that I was protecting the mission, the fleet, that your actions were genuinely reckless and that the court-martial, end quote. He stopped. End quote, I and Appos. V told myself many things, end quote. End quote, I know, end quote, I said. End quote, I Don and Appos. Know if I can ask for forgiveness. I and Appos, am not sure I and Appos. V earned the right to ask. End quote. I looked out at the yard. The fireflies were small and numerous and calm, doing what they do without drama or audience, lighting themselves up briefly in the dark. End quote, you didn't and Appos. Ruined my life, end quote, I said. He was quiet. End quote, you made it smaller for a while. Harder. You took things from me that I would have liked to keep. End quote, I thought about promotion boards. About an office in the Pentagon I and Appos. Once imagined. About the younger version of myself who had wanted things she never got to want for long. End quote, but you didn't and Appos ruin it. I did some of the ruining myself. I let the anger, end quote. I paused, searching for the honest version. End quote. I let it become a reason not to try, end quote. End quote, that was my fault, end quote. End quote, it was mine too. End quote, I said this gently. End quote, we Don and Appos. Get to assign all of it outward. I chose for a long time to stay small. To stay hidden. The hiding felt like safety and it was also a kind of giving up. On myself. You gave me a reason but I made the choice. End quote. The fireflies in the yard. End quote. I forgive you, end quote, I said. End quote. I want you to know that and Appos. Not a gift to you. It and Appos house cleaning. I and Appos. V been carrying a room full of it for 20 years and I and Appos. Like to put it down somewhere and walk away, end quote. He said. End quote. I and Appos am sorry. End quote. End quote, I know, end quote, I said. End quote, I believe you. End quote. We said goodbye. I Don and Appos. Know what happens to Leonard Voorhees now. That is, in the deepest sense, not my story to tell anymore. What followed I didn't and Appos. Plan and Kuden and Appos. Have. Jim Harrow and Thomas Rees had, between them, spoken to people. The kind of people who make calls to other people who can make things happen. There was a brief, formal review. Not a trial, not a ceremony, just a careful and quiet correction of a record that had been incorrect for 2 decades. The notation was removed. They offered me a decoration, a physical object to represent the event in a canyon in 2003. I thought I wore my uniform again. 3 months after Arlington, I was invited to speak at a Veterans and Oppos support group in Mobile. Someone had read a brief account of the story in a military publication and had reached out to Petra, who had asked me, who had said yes before I and Oppos finished thinking about whether to say it. The group met in the basement of a church, which has its own particular acoustics, slightly damp, voices that travel differently than in ballrooms. There were perhaps 20 people. Some of them were young, combat veterans with the particular stillness of people managing enormous interiors. Some were older, my generation, carrying things from wars that have since become historical instead of personal. A few were women. I had prepared something to say about the importance of speaking out, about the systems of institutional power that silence people. I had it in my head, organized, rehearsed. I didn't in Oppos say any of it. What I said instead was this. End quote. For 22 years, I told myself that staying quiet was protection, that if I spoke about what had been done to me, I would be diminished by the speaking of it, that the people who had taken my story away had somehow taken the story itself, and I should let them have it because fighting for it back would cost me more than it was worth. End quote. I looked at the room. End quote. I was wrong about all of that. The story was mine the whole time. It was waiting for me. It turns out stories dawn in Oppos actually go away. They just wait underground in the dark until you and Oppos ready to go down there and get them. End quote. A woman in the third row was nodding. She had the look of someone who knows exactly what underground feels like. End quote. The thing I wasn't and Oppos prepared for, end quote, I said, end quote, was how much lighter I would feel. Not because the history changed. It didn't end Oppos The history is the history, it stays. But I had been spending so much energy carrying the injustice of it, the outrage, the grief, all that weight forward. And the weight was real. I and Oppos am not saying it wasn't an Oppos but somewhere along the way the carrying had become the whole point. I had organized my life around the carrying. And when I put it down, end quote, I stopped. Found the words. End quote. When I put it down I had all this space. I didn't in Oppos know what to do with the space at first. Space is uncomfortable when you and Oppos been cramped for a long time. End quote. A man in the back laughed softly, recognizing it. End quote. What I want to say to you, end quote, I said, end quote, is that the thing you went through is real. The way it changed you is real. The people who should have protected you and didn't and Oppos or who actively made it worse, their failure is real and you don't and Oppos have to shrink it to survive it. End quote. I paused. End quote. But the carrying, the weight. At some point the weight becomes the thing that in Oppos hurting you, not them. And you can set it down. Not for them. Not to let them off the hook. For you. Because you have, somewhere in this room, I promise you this, you have a life that is waiting for you to show up to it. End quote. I thought about fireflies. About a yard in Alabama. About a braided gray braid that Petra called dignified and Derek once called scraggly, and how Derek at the 4th of July gathering afterward, he had called me and apologized, stumbling through it awkwardly in Derek and Oppos' way. Derek had said, asterisk, I didn't and Oppos no. I and Oppos am sorry. I didn't and Oppos no. Asterisk. And I had said, asterisk, most people don't and Oppos that and Oppos not their fault. That and Oppos the point. Asterisk. I am 71 years old. I have gray hair I no longer bother coloring. I wear it in a braid. My hands resting on my knees know things the rest of me is still learning to live with. I live in a small house in Alabama, but it is not a hiding place anymore. The difference is internal. A door I have opened. I still go to the Veterans and Oppos group in Mobile most months. Sometimes I speak. Sometimes I just sit and listen, which is its own kind of presence, its own kind of offering. I have learned that the act of being witnessed, of having someone sit with you in your heaviness without trying to fix it or diminish it, is one of the most radical things a person can do for another person. Petra visits on weekends when she can. She brought me a new lawn chair. This one doesn't in Oppos sink. Thomas Reese sent a photograph. Himself, his wife, his 4 grandchildren, standing in front of a very large horse that the youngest, Mara, is clearly attempting to hug. He wrote on the back, asterisk because you circled back. T.R. Asterisk. I have it on the windowsill in my kitchen, where I see it every morning. I made the potato salad last month for a neighborhood gathering. The right amount of mustard, the dill, turned out fine. Asterisk what they don in Oppos. T tell you about courage, not the books, not the speeches, not the medals, is that the hardest part is never the canyon. The canyon is clear. The canyon has walls and a clock and a burning fact. Someone is dying. You know what to do in the canyon. Asterisk. Asterisk the hardest part is the 22 years after. The waking up in a small house and making coffee and deciding, again, whether today is the day you are willing to take up the space you are owed. Whether today you will believe that you deserve to be in the room. Asterisk. Asterisk the answer I have found is yes. The answer is always yes. You just have to keep finding your way back to it. Asterisk. That and Oppos. The thing about circling back. You get to practice. End.